September 27, 1942. Swan Island, Shipyard, Portland, Oregon. The sky was still dark when the whistle shrieked, piercing the cold mist rising from the Willamette River as the first shift marched through Gate 4 under the glow of floodlights mounted to newly welded gantries. The scent of burning metal clung to the air, mixing with the sharp tang of oil and salt water. Dozens of workers, men and women wrapped in heavy wool coats and thick gloves, moved in choreographed lines through the yard, their boots clinking against the corrugated steel decking. Sparks spit from overhead cranes and welding arcs, illuminating the riveted hulls that loomed like armored giants in the dim morning light. Inside Shed 42, 19-year-old Dorothy Kent adjusted her protective visor and struck her torch to life. She could feel the heat of it through her gloves and hear the steady sizzle as molten puddles formed beneath her hand, laying bead after bead without a pause. She had learned to weld in just 2 weeks. Now she was responsible for the bulkheads of the Liberty ship SS John R. McQuigg, scheduled to launch in less than 18 hours. "It doesn't stop," she would later recall in an oral history for the Oregon Historical Society. "You finish one, and they roll in another before you can even clean your gear." By mid-1942, the Kaiser shipyards had redefined the tempo of naval logistics. In Portland, Richmond, and Vancouver, crews worked under a revolutionary modular system devised by industrialist Henry J. Kaiser. Instead of building hulls from keel up on slips, shipwrights fabricated pre-fitted sections in parallel, then winched them into place like segments of a colossal jigsaw. Components flowed from prefabrication shops to slipways on elevated tracks, numbered, color-coded, and marked down to the bolt. Welder crews practiced what they called rapid joins, a technique that synchronized torchwork across wider seams in shorter windows, often working in tandem with riveters hammering behind thermal curtains. Each part of the process was timed to the second. One Liberty ship could have as many as 250,000 individual parts, some weighing up to 10 tons. And somehow each piece found its place in less than a day. "We didn't think of ourselves as fast," said Assembly Coordinator Harold T. Redwine in a 1961 interview. "Speed came from not stopping. We were always moving to the next weld." The stakes behind this furious pace were no abstraction from the front. In the 12 months before Dorothy Kent lit her torch, German U-boats had sunk over 6 million tons of Allied shipping in the Atlantic. In January 1942 alone, 56 American vessels were lost off the East Coast. Strategically, the Liberty ship was designed for this fight, not for battle, but for endurance. It was 441 feet long, with a 56-foot beam, and could carry over 10,000 tons of cargo. Each came equipped with 2 3-inch guns and 8 20mm anti-aircraft cannons for defense. But their true weapon was quantity. The Admiralty didn't need marvels of engineering. It needed bulk, reliability, and speed of production. That urgency translated into a workforce of over 100,000 across Kaiser's yards, dock workers, pipe fitters, crane operators, and more than 24,000 welders. Many were women, teenagers, and black laborers brought in under Roosevelt's Executive Order 8802, which banned discriminatory hiring in defense industries. The war forged more than ships. It reshaped the American labor force irreversibly, beat by beat, weld by weld. 3 miles away at the Vancouver yard, 22-year-old Anthony Ramirez clocked in for the night shift, just as Kent's team neared completion of the McQuigg bow section. He ducked under chains of welding cable draped across the floor and checked the wall chart cataloging subassemblies. His assignment: upper deck superstructure installation on hull number 1243. Shot-blasted I-beams lay stacked like bones on flatbed trolleys, waiting for torch crews to splice them with half-inch welds to the ship's forward housing. Every movement had a rhythm, honed from repetition. Ramirez took his first job at the yard 6 months earlier, after Greyhound carried him from Marfa, Texas to the Pacific Northwest on a one-way ticket arranged by the War Manpower Commission. He wrote home weekly, describing the weeks in numbers. 80, 4 hours, 16 weld seams completed, 3 teammates out with nitrogen burns, One launch watched from the dry dock scaffold. "They say Kaiser's trying for a 24-hour ship," he wrote in April. "It's not a race. It's just what comes next." Back in Portland's Yard 3, Supervisor Clara Jenkins strode between the hulls with a clipboard wedged under her arm, her breath frosting in the morning air. At just 29, she managed over 70 workers in Hold Assembly Line B, more than half of them hired within the past year. She had started as a riveter on the SS Benjamin Warner, but had quickly proven her skill for managing logistics and people under pressure. Her section was responsible for installing the ship's cargo hold bulkheads, each frame arriving in staggered deliveries from the on-site steel shop located 400 feet away. Delays weren't tolerated. If the panels warped or arrived a minute late, the entire line had to recalibrate. Clara kept the line moving with handwritten schedules, white chalk updates on steel walls, and constant radio check-ins. "It's like breathing," she told the Oregon Labor Journal in a 1944 profile. "You keep it flowing, or the whole thing flatlines. We didn't build ships, we kept the bloodstream alive." By October 3, 1942, the stakes had escalated yet again. Allied forces had landed at Guadalcanal 2 months earlier, and Navy Transport Command desperately needed reinforcements to sustain the offensive. At the Swan Island Yard, an emergency order came down for 3 Liberty hulls to be expedited, with revised delivery targets cut by a full 8 hours. Over in Prefab Base 6, Foreman Vic Krawczyk rerouted 10 crews from non-critical assignments to rush weld new center deck assemblies. The scale was Herculean. Steel sheets, 2 inches thick, were maneuvered by synchronized crane lifts, while grinders cleared flash seams for torch passes. Supervisors shouted times from industrial stopwatches. Every process was squeezed for margin. That week, the yard finished 3 complete ships in 76 hours. Welding rod consumption doubled. One welder, 20-year-old Bernice Lee, recalled losing 12 pounds in 6 days. "I never sat down," she told an Army Signal Corps interviewer. "People think adrenaline is for battle. Ours came from countdown boards." 1,500 miles away in Mobile, Alabama, a different kind of transformation was underway. At the Alabama Dry Dock and Shipbuilding Company, a previously segregated workforce was being reassembled under federal pressure and wartime necessity. On October 10, 1942, John Wesley Carter, a 35-year-old pipe welder from Birmingham, stood in the locker room beside 18-year-old Ernestine Fields, a newly hired welding apprentice. They were among the first black workers permitted to join integrated welding crews on hull construction for the SS George Washington Carver. The line foreman stood silent as 3 units moved out of dry jig alignment, torch crews correcting deficits with quick, practiced bevel fills. Carter lit his torch without a word. Nobody spoke much that day. Fields wrote in a letter to her older sister, kept today at the Schomburg Center for Research in Black Culture. But every arc we struck made more noise than anything they could say to keep us out. By October 18, 1942, the welders at Swan Island had reached what some started calling the miracle curve. A production tempo so fast that measurements ceased to be weeks or even days, but broken down into hours and minutes. Hull 1319, tentatively named SS William A. Coulter, was dry stacked by noon and hit the water by dawn the next day. More than 700 workers signed off on the final inspection, their initials etched in grease pencil across a maze of access hatches and sealed chambers. Clarence O'Hara, a lead structure welder from Missoula, Montana, watched it slide into the Willamette with smoke still clinging to its seams. "It ain't even cool yet," his apprentice joked, cradling his helmet. In truth, it wasn't. The steel hissed as it touched the chilled river, and a cheer erupted from the banks. In that moment, surrounded by acetylene rigs and thermite slug barrels, fatigue gave way to something else, an understanding that each spark they struck was steering the war's tide, one weld line at a time. Just after midnight, on October 21, 1942, whistles blew across the Richmond Shipyard No. 2 in California as the final weld cooled on hull number 1324 SS Robert E. Peary. Engineers and foremen from Bethlehem Steel had tightly coordinated each phase of its assembly, deploying 1,400 workers across staggered blocks around the clock. Unlike previous ships, the Peary's construction was tracked minute by minute from the first keel plate to the launch rails. The result: 4 days faster than the McQuig, cutting the previous record nearly in half. At 4:00 a.m., the ship descended into the bay in the span of 10 minutes. By afternoon, radio bulletins across the country declared that a new global benchmark had been set. In Washington, Vice Admiral Emory S. Land of the U.S. Maritime Commission issued a statement calling it proof that liberty can outpace tyranny with sweat and steel. For the welders who built it, the achievement was tangible, but not unusual. As shipwright Donald H. Truax told the San Francisco Chronicle that week, "We just kept going. They gave us the parts. We gave them a ship every 24 hours." 40 miles inland, on the factory floor of Kaiser's Oregon Shipbuilding Corporation in St. John's, 16-year-old high school student Peter Nakamura stepped onto Assembly Line 3 flanked by tool chests and steel rails still warm from plasma cuts. He had only joined the week prior through a special youth apprentice waiver and had lied about his age. His older brother Tom had enlisted with the 442nd Regimental Combat Team weeks earlier, while Peter remained stateside under the shadow of Executive Order 9066, which had interned thousands of Japanese Americans, including their parents. He kept his head down and hands steady, avoiding eye contact, and followed line foreman Eva Meyer's signals exactly. They were working hull number 1342, destined for North Africa under Operation Torch. He didn't miss a step, Myers later said in a 1978 oral testimony. "I don't think he blinked the whole shift. Every strike of his rod looked like defiance." In Portland's waterfront warforge, lineage and language dissolved under the arc. Welders carried no rifles, yet each fitted seam and tempered plate became armor for another front, bearing the silent markings of thousands who shaped steel as if time itself was chasing them. By November 2, 1942, coordination between shipyards reached an unprecedented scale. The Warshipping Administration launched Joint Production Directive 117, a system that synchronized logistics between Portland, Richmond, Mobile, and Wilmington under a unified scheduling matrix. Steel plates were now routed via rail cars, in sealed lots, labeled for exact hull numbers before loading began. At Yard 1 in Portland, Dock Superintendent Eleanor Stokes monitored inventories using punch card verifications linked to IBM tabulators. A ship's skeleton could be digitally planned 2 weeks out, then manually assembled in under 2 days. In one 96-hour stretch, her team processed over 1,800 tons of schedule-critical steel. "We weren't just welding ships," she said in a 1951 hearing before the Federal Maritime Board. "We were reverse engineering time. We made the future arrive faster." Across every beam fastened and weld joint filled, a quiet revolution of labor, logistics, and ingenuity unfolded, a force not just of manpower, but of unrelenting coordination that, day by day, turned roaring furnaces and human resolve into floating arsenals that crossed oceans faster than their enemies could count them. On November 9, 1942, as Operation Torch commenced on the shores of French North Africa, the SS Robert E. Peary offloaded its first cargo of Sherman tanks and jeeps onto Algerian soil just 19 days after its keel had been laid. That same morning, on a catwalk above Slipway 2 in Richmond, Elizabeth Nearing, Code Inspector for Hull Integrity Division B, signed off on weld seam 442C, the last required approval before hull 1356 could be greenlit for ballast tests. Her signature joined hundreds more on Inspection Ledger 274, a document now archived at the National Maritime Museum, bearing the weight of a ship conjured almost entirely from speed. Nearby cranes hoisted ship sections already stamped for hull 1357. Barely paused, the line surged ahead. In less than a year, American welders had tunefully choreographed a system where speed, inclusion, and expertise combined to produce a Liberty ship every 24 hours, each one a floating rebuttal to despair. The war was far from over, but in the foundries of flame and steel, the tide had begun to turn. October 21st, 1945. Swan Island Shipyard, Portland, Oregon. The whistles no longer shrieked, but the silence rang with memory. A plaque by Gate 4 read simply, "They built the ships. The ships carried the war changed the world." 5,000 miles east, along the harrowed coastline of Normandy, the cargo once carried by ships like the SS John R. McQuigg now lay strewn across shattered dunes and hedgerows. Bulldozers, tanks, rations, cranes, all had arrived under fire, courtesy of unnamed welders whose signatures never left plumbing valves or hatch corners. In a quiet moment aboard the USS Susan B. Anthony just prior to D-Day, Lieutenant Commander Charles W. Wilson wrote in his logbook, "No vessel here was built to win medals. They were built fast enough to outrun defeat." That legacy endured. Between 1941 and 1945, over 2,710 Liberty ships were produced. Nearly 1,400 were welded in Kaiser yards alone. The men and women behind their construction did not march, yet their work mobilized entire divisions. On docks now empty and gantries turned to rust, the imprint of those welders remained not as bronze statues or holiday parades, but as the enduring steel language of urgency, resolve, and belief. In smoke and silence, they reshaped history, one spark at a time. The foundries fell quiet long before the last Liberty ship was retired. By the early 1970s, only a handful remained in service. Many converted for cargo, training, or scrapped for metal. Yet remnants endured. In Baltimore Harbor, the SS John W. Brown became a floating museum. In Oakland, parts of Yard 2 were absorbed into the Port of Richmond. But for the welders who once stood side by side amid smoke and flame, the echoes lived on not in monuments, but in gestures hardened palms, a way of checking weld seams with bare fingertips, letters tucked in forgotten toolboxes. In 1981, at a reunion held in a Portland Union Hall, Dorothy Kent, Bernice Lee, and Anthony Ramirez raised a toast beside a rusted gantry pin. No bands played, no speeches given, just a nod and the clink of pint glasses. They had built ships in days. They had altered the tempo of war. And when history asked what beat turned steel into salvation, they had answered with fire. Today, the ghost of that tempo lingers in the hulls that rust quietly in forgotten bays, and in the hands of granddaughters learning to weld for reasons far from war. The pace that once turned raw steel into lifelines now echoes through vocational programs, industrial heritage trails, and the memories of those who inherited more than stories. Kaiser's yards are gone, their furnaces extinguished. Yet each ship forged during those brief, relentless years stood as proof that coordination, inclusion, and sheer endurance can alter the course of history. American welders did not wait for the world to change. They cut, struck, and shaped it, 24 hours at a time. And in every ripple across the ocean, their work still moves silently forward, bearing the weight of what they built and what they believed. In a decommissioned corner of the Oregon Museum of Science and Industry, a torch, once used by Dorothy Kent, rests beneath a protective case. Its handle is blackened and cracked, the metal nozzle dulled from years of flame. Visitors pass it often without pause, unaware that its operator once helped push back the tide of Axis ambition with nothing more than precision and grit. Nearby, a set of union-issued overalls embroidered with Ramirez's badge number hangs beside rusted welding clamps and a faded work permit signed in 1942. These objects do not shout, they endure. Like the welders themselves, they stand watch in silence, offering no decoration, only legacy. The warships they helped build now sleep beneath breakers or rot in silent harbors. But the story of how Americans, hour by hour, section by section, forced progress out of pressure, remains welded into the national memory. Their flame may have cooled, but their line holds still. On a quiet afternoon in 1993, decades removed from the rattle of cranes and shriek of alarms, The Liberty ship SS Jeremiah O'Brien reversed under her own restored steam through the Golden Gate, passing beneath rusty girders that once carried wartime steel. She was one of only 2 Liberty ships still seaworthy, resurrected by volunteers, some of them welders who had once labored under wartime blackout curtains. Among them was Clara Jenkins, now 80, wrapped in a navy peacoat adorned with her original punch card badge. She stood at the railing, eyes glinting with recognition as the pier shrank behind them. Below deck, her initials could still be found scrawled in grease pencil across frame 12B, untouched since 1943. The ship's engines thudded with rhythmic constancy, less a voyage than an echo. As she watched the shoreline slip away, Jenkins whispered to no one in particular, "We built it once, and we remembered how." She passed beneath the bridge like a memory made manifest, flags fluttering against the wind-blown silence of the bay. Fishermen paused their lines, tourists lifted cameras, and somewhere a radio broadcast the faint drone of an old Glenn Miller tune that once played in mess halls beside welding sheds. The SS Jeremiah O'Brien powered forward, unhurried, unshaken, bearing traces not just of war but of the people who made her. Welders like Kent, Ramirez, Lee, and Jenkins had moved steel with resolve, proving that endurance, precision, and unity could construct more than vessels, they could construct victory. And as the ship disappeared toward the horizon, her wake trailed not just foam, but history, quietly carrying forward the proof that in America's hour of need, ordinary hands built the extraordinary every 24 hours. And so the torch passed not ceremonially, but through calloused hands and quiet instruction in workshops and classrooms across generations. Welding schools from Tulsa to Oakland displayed black and white photographs of gantry lines and flame-lit hulls. In exhibit halls and faintly humming simulation bays, instructors referenced the systems that once beat tyranny with timing: modular assembly, rapid join sequencing, total process integration. Every arc lit by a student today flickers with inherited purpose. Not every war summons weapons. Some summon speed, precision, sweat, layered into steel. The science of welding may have advanced, but the heartbeat remains unchanged. What American welders proved from Portland to Mobile was not merely that ships could be built in 24 hours. They proved that when time becomes the enemy, unity becomes the tool. Piece by piece, minute by minute, they forged a legacy not of war, but of will, one that still holds, unbroken, just beneath the surface of every hull that braved the tide. In a training bay at the Pearl Harbor Naval Shipyard, 22-year-old apprentice Haley Okimoto lowers her helmet and steadies her hand against the curved flank of a mock pressure vessel. Her torch sputters to life, casting a blue glow over steel that bears none of the age but all of the inheritance of Liberty ship bloodlines. She moves slowly, deliberately, not to race against time, but to earn its lessons. On the wall behind her hangs a framed photograph, yellowed and cracked, of Dorothy Kent with torch in hand at Swan Island. Next to it, a schematic from Hull 1243, its weld sequence annotated with grease pencil ticks. Okimoto doesn't know their names yet, but she traces their work with precision, the way others trace history in books. Her instructor, a former shipfitter from Bremerton, watches in silence, then nods once. "That's solid," he says. "They'd have run with that." Outside, the clang of machines continues. Inside, a legacy is being re-welded by memory, by instruction, and by hands still willing to meet steel with fire. Years from now, when the red arcs fade and the names blur into the iron records of industry, the legacy will remain in form far quieter than ceremony. It will live in the lines of hull blueprints passed between mentors and students, in smudged textbooks bearing corners turned by tired hands, and in sparks flying in classrooms where history is not read but rehearsed with every strike. The story of how American welders built a warship every 24 hours is not just numbers or nostalgia. It is a doctrine carved in steel and anchored in labor. It says that unity can accelerate innovation, that courage does not always carry a rifle, and that when pace and purpose align under pressure, the impossible folds and yields. In the glow of torches yet to be lit, in the grit of apprentices who measure twice and weld once, the ghost of Swan Island breathes, not for glory, but because once, someone built the future in a single day, and someone else is still learning how. So when future generations walk the decks of preserved ships or grip MiG torches in training booths far from war, they do more than remember, they continue. They connect with the cadence first hammered into the Kaiser yards and echoed in every 24-hour build, whether in classrooms in San Diego, community colleges in Georgia, or on virtual simulators decoding weld codes and critical angles. Students today step into an unbroken relay. They learn that craftsmanship under duress does not compromise, it clarifies. That steel is as much story as structure, and that across time and tide, the tools remain steady even as the hands change. What began on September 27, 1942, beneath Portland's floodlights has not ended. It reverberates in each bead, laid clean, each joint past inspection, each young welder who bends to flame and follows a line once drawn to save the world. And so history does not close here, it holds its arc. And beneath that arc, history waits not silent, but alive in process, in weld certification labs, aboard retired vessels, across spreadsheets that map fabrication for peacetime fleets. The pulse continues. American welders once matched clocks against catastrophe and prevailed. They set the rhythm in rivets, found momentum in molten forms, and answered the harrowing question of how fast, with faster still. Their legacy stands not in myth, but in measurement: 440 feet of ship in 24 hours, 250,000 parts, aligned with hands that never paused. That blueprint endures, not only in forms or footage, but in fire passed steadily from torch to torch. And so we remember not with speeches or silence, but with skill, sweat, and sparks that know where they came from. That is how they built ships. That is how they built history, one weld at a time. As the final torch is returned to its hook and the last echo fades across the dry dock, the story completes not with crescendo but with continuity. What began as emergency manufacturing became American mastery, choreographed not by generals, but by foremen, switchboard operators, and welders who saw urgency not as chaos, but as coordination. From Swan Island to Mobile, Liberty ships sailed not just with cargo, but conviction. Each seam reflecting the will of the 1,000 hands that made it whole. Across generations, that rhythm survives in blueprints archived, in badges preserved, in classrooms where ignition still means inheritance. The heroism of welders lies not in memory alone, but in motion sustained. As long as sparks fly and steel answers back, their cadence holds steady, carried forward, unbroken, through every ship yet to be shaped and every future dared into form. 78 years after Dorothy Kent first struck her arc inside Shed 42, the legacy of American wartime welding endures in the unlikeliest of places, along a classroom wall in a vocational school in Spokane, Washington, where her great-granddaughter now teaches arc stability to a room of first-year apprentices. The flame is cooler, the room quieter, and the stakes no longer mortal, yet the rhythm remains. Welding tables scarred by years of trial mirror those once lined with Liberty ship fixtures. Charts still time weld sequences, though now on tablets instead of chalkboards. At the end of one bench hangs a black and white photo of a launch at Swan Island. The caption reads only, 24 hours, every ship, every time. No epilogue, no fanfare, just the quiet presence of a story built from steel, motion, and the belief that time under pressure can forge more than metal. It can forge the future. Outside the shop window, Spokane's sky fades toward Auburn, welding arcs dimming against the evening light. Inside, Kent's great-granddaughter walks the line between benches, correcting grips, adjusting angles, nodding in silence as sparks jump and fizzle toward clean seams. Her students rarely know the full history, only hints, photographs, fragments, stories written in metal. But when she pauses before each student's weld, running a gloved finger along a new bead, she carries forward something larger than instruction. In the rhythm of torch clicks and the smell of warmed steel, the past remains present. What Swan Island once roared, this small classroom now hums, that in moments of great urgency, ordinary hands can hold extraordinary power. And though the final Liberty ship sleeps beneath salt and time, the legacy of its making is struck anew each day in fire, in form, in every weld laid with care and conscience. No longer bound to wartime urgency, but still driven by its lessons, the discipline of welding in America persists not in the shadow of shipyards, but in the steady hands of those who build hospitals, bridges, water systems, and space vehicles. The same precision that once closed the seam on hull 1, 3, 2, 4, now binds titanium frames bound for orbit, stainless pipelines coursing beneath cities, and steel frameworks rising into new skylines. The hands have changed, but the ethic holds. Every fillet weld and root pass carries echoes of a generation that turned the tide not with arms, but with arc. And as cranes settle and tools return to racks, history watches quietly not from above, but from within the weld line itself, where pressure still meets purpose, and steel, still, obeys the steady hands that shape it. In the dim silence of the Spokane shop's closing hour, helmet visors are lifted, gloves are shed, and benches wiped clean. The buzz of activity gives way to quiet pride. Kent's great-granddaughter marks attendance on her tablet, then glances once more at the wall where the photo from Swan Island presides like a sentinel from another era. Her eyes settle not on the ship's plume ablaze behind the launch or the crane arms reaching skyward, but on the faces young, determined, alight with purpose. Some are long gone, their names etched in archives and ship manifests, but their rhythm lives on, translated now into each lesson taught within these walls. As students file out into the chill Spokane air, their boots tapping against concrete just as once on steel decking, the story continues not retold, but relived. For in each student who lifts a torch and leans into their work with care and clarity, there burns the same unyielding truth. That time, when wielded with unity and precision, can be turned from adversary to asset. One ship, every 24 hours, and ever forward. Back inside the classroom, a student hesitates over a final joint, the tungsten tip trembling slightly before tracing its arc forward. The instructor leans closer, correcting posture with a touch to the elbow, then watches silently as the bead steadies and forms smooth along the seam. Around them, the tools are dimmed, the lesson complete. But something deeper lingers, an inheritance passed not through medals or speeches, but through motion, materials, and memory. From Swan Island to Spokane, the blueprint remains the same. Learn the craft, trust the process, and understand that with every measured weld, another generation adds its name to the unbroken line. Across time and through steel, they built something that never stopped moving, and here, beneath the hum of fluorescent lights and the quiet clatter of closing shop doors, it moves still. One ship, every 24 hours, and ever forward. When the last lights flicker off and the hum of torches gives way to quiet reflection, the story holds fast, not as a monument made of marble, but as a rhythm carried forward in every steady hand and vigilant eye behind the visor. The welders of Liberty ships didn't just brace steel against water and war, they sculpted process into permanence. Their legacy is welded into bridges, vessels, and futures yet to be drawn. And even now, long after the smoke has cleared from Slipway 2 and the river Willamette flows past Bramble and Rust, the line continues student to journeyman, mentor to flame, generation to steel. For in America, where the torch is passed without pause, the question isn't whether history remembers, it's whether we are ready to build again. One seam, one spark, every 24 hours, and always forward. So when the shift begins again, whether in shipyards or training bays beneath buzzing lights, it isn't just steel that's being shaped. Its memory placed into motion, the forward lean of a country that once welded its way through war by trusting hands over haste and precision over panic. That motion endures. One spark, one seam, every 24 hours, and always, always forward,